which he reached in 1352. At this time, the empire of Mali still dominated the western Sudan, and Ibn Battuta gives an extremely interesting and human account of some of its institutions. Here's what he says. Speaking in the year 1352, 100 and some years before the discovery of America, quote, "The Negroes possess some admirable qualities." The Negroes, meaning us, this is before America was discovered, possess some admirable qualities. They are seldom unjust, have a greater abhorrence of injustice than any other people. Now pick up on it. Here this man, before America is discovered, is talking about black people are different from white people. Isn't that what he said? He said black people are against injustice. Black people are more so against injustice than any other people are against injustice. Why, this follows, you know the white man is not against injustice. He wouldn't have this country if he was. And he wouldn't have you here if he was. You wouldn't be as dumb as you are if the white man was against injustice. Don't be angry when I say you wouldn't be as dumb as you are. Because when I say, I mean we, all of us, we're all in the same boat. And we're dumb. Don't say we're not. How are we going to be in this boat if we weren't dumb? You can't put a wise man in this kind of shape, and we're in bad shape. You don't get in this kind of shape being wise. You get in this kind of shape being dumb. Right or wrong? And now, brothers and sisters, despite this description of your and my people, the level that we were on culturally, spiritually, intellectually, academically, politically, socially, and otherwise, 200 years before the discovery of America, oh, look at us now. What happened to us? How could it be possible for someone to function and live and exist at such a high level then and come down to such a low level today? How could it be possible for you and me to be at such a high cultural level that the scientists of that day wrote books about us and marveled at us, and many relics of our civilization served as the wonders of the ancient world? And today everybody is looking at us in wonder, wondering how we could come from so high to so low in such a short period of time.
If you listen to several leaders of African descent of every field, mainly political leaders, and also the popular narrative amongst African people, they will tell the world that we have made progress, that black people have overcome the horrors of oppression and fully living their lives towards the pursuit of happiness with liberty and justice. Many buy into this narrative because, number one, the media feeds the world this illusion that everyone can succeed despite cultural differences, props up several hand-picked black people who are multi-millionaires, and present them to the world, clouding the realities of the masses of our people that are suffering of daily. This at times can make it very difficult to express and articulate to individuals that believe this brainwashing campaign against African people, saying we have made considerable progress. Let's deal with what happened to us as a whole. The popular narrative among African people and the world over is that our history in the West started with our enslavement, and compared to the state of our people then to now is significant progress. This ties to our identity. During our Holocaust as African people, we were stripped of many key human traits that made us a complete human being. Stripped of our original names, our language, our spiritual systems, our culture, you name it, in the New World, while Africans on the continent were colonized with invisible boundaries, culture, and new languages forced on them, and it intensified the warring among them, and all this created by their European colonizers. Our radical hospitality and not understanding that Europeans don't see the world like we do led to this as well. Being very nice and humane got us in serious trouble, even though there are native African leaders that fought European expansion bravely. Western media created a captivating anti-African campaign that branded African people and the continent of Africa in an extreme negative light, to the point where our people for the most part want no parts of our ancestral homeland, want no parts of our history, and we identify with our oppressors by identity confusion, denying our natural identity, and took on the oppressor's name, language, and culture. The world-renowned great African-centered scholar and activist Amos Wilson once said, "We recognize, as Garvey recognized, that this lack of knowledge was deliberately induced into the mind and psyche of black people. We cannot be Africans and slaves at the same time. We cannot hold onto our African identity, our African selves, knowledge of our African culture, and be enslaved, the subordinates of another people. It is only when the knowledge is removed, erased, degraded, stolen, taken, and distorted that we lose our identity. Therefore, a lack of self-knowledge is a lack of self-awareness. A lack of self-awareness is insensitivity to the self." What took place afterwards was a racial and ethnic hierarchy disproportionately distributed nearly 100% control and ownership of wealth, material resources, and privileges to whites at the top of the social order, while blacks assigned the lowest level were disproportionately burdened with poverty, powerlessness, and social exclusion. Then the dominant society used its power to label blacks lazy, ignorant, and criminal, then enact laws that denied them jobs, education, and justice. And through the most insidious of all, dominant society used its social powers, its media outlets, to assign an intensely negative human worth on black skin color that caused millions of blacks to fear each other and hate themselves. What is Africa to me? It's the question which has dominated the history of African peoples in the Western world ever since we were forcefully uprooted from our ancestral homeland, and herein lies, that seems to me, to be the central paradox of the history of our people. Remembrance of Africa has dominated our being, our very existence. One of the important reasons to rediscovery of our natural roots, a Sankofa experience if you will, for diasporic Africans to look at the global history of African people, you will have to agree that we haven't made progress at all. You can't point to the way Africans for the most part were living in these flourishing civilizations with their own government, political, economic, and social systems that were self-reliant and tell us that we made progress. Only a person with a limited view of our history will believe that. You can't point to what the ancestors were achieving in ancient Kemet, Egypt, and said we made progress. You can't point to what the ancestors were achieving in ancient Ethiopia, Nubia, and said we made progress. You can't point to what the ancestors were doing in Great Zimbabwe and said we made progress. You can't point to the powerful West African nations of Songhai, Mali, Ghana, and Benin and said we made progress. These civilizations that our ancestors brought into existence were marveled at by unprejudiced non-Africans of every race, from the early Greek writers to Arab and European visitors that looked at the achievements of our ancestors with a non-prejudiced eye and recorded it accurately in our history, which helped combat some of the negative anti-African campaign that has gripped the hearts and minds of people worldwide. In Walter Rodney's book, Grounded with My Brothers, he states that in the great empires of the Western Sudan, Arab visitors from North Africa never failed to be impressed by the security afforded to goods and persons, even when movement over long distances was involved. The movement of traders along the paths in the Akan country was equally safe, and these conditions existed in much more humble African societies. The Senegalese Djola were described by Mungo Park as barbarous, but he found that he could leave his possessions among the people for months on end without suffering any losses. This public order is maintained not only by an extensive police force, but by the constraint of the community as a whole. Of course, crime did exist in the society, and it was dealt with by a complex code of customary laws, which in recent years have become the subject of scientific inquiry. The basic principle of justice was restitution, the subject of the legal judgment being to help the wrong party rather than inflict punishment on the offender. It is significant that one hears of nothing resembling a jail without indigenous African society, nor is there any evidence of stocks, fetters, and the like. European visitors of West Africa in the 15th and 16th centuries were struck by the mildness and the human nature of the laws. Capital punishment, for example, was rare, being completely absent from some societies. What is most fundamental is the attempt to evaluate the African contribution to the solution of the problems imposed by man's existence in society, and hence the stress placed in this paper's matters pertaining to social relations, codes of conduct, processes of law, public order, and social and religious tolerance. In each of those areas of human social activity, African norms and practices were given a high value by Europeans themselves. They often reflected that the hospitality they saw in an African village was lacking in their communities, that the security of goods and persons in Africa stood in marked contrast to the depredations in Europe. The restraint of African law with respect to capital punishment was to be set off against that fact that dozens of offenses were still punishable by death in European societies up until the 16th century. Africans were not steeped in darkness. That, after all, is the great myth which we are still struggling to discard from the minds of our own brothers and sisters here in the Americas. Their fear is that the Africa which they left is one of premature savagery. They visualize ape-like blacks swinging from the tree to tree and hearing the licking of cannibal chops. To dispel this myth, it is invariably necessary to be pointed out that in Africa too had great buildings and great states similar to those which emerged in the history of those countries where our white oppressors and degenerators reside. Both to complement and to transcend that type of instruction, we have to also base ourselves solidly within the culture of Africa.
And let's just say we start our history with slavery in the West. Can we honestly look at our history in the Reconstruction era and pre-integration era and say we made progress? Look at the thriving black communities of the 1920s like Tulsa, Oklahoma, Rosewood, Florida, Durham, and Wilmington, North Carolina. And a strong argument can be made we haven't made progress since slavery. Because look at today. More than 140 years ago, we are quote-unquote 100% free, yet we still own only 0.5% of this nation's wealth. You have a widening gap of income equality compared to whites, and a large percentage of us are living below the poverty line. Around 87% of the nation's economic access are frozen within the white society and passed on from generation to generation through stocks, bonds, land, businesses, trust accounts, etc., while our people are concentrated on surviving because so many of us live under the poverty line with little to no support, and we inherit welfare, public housing, and a good job. When we so-called integrated our communities in the 60s, we lost the best minds that went to various white institutions to enrich the white society. We lost our sports leagues, our independent sports leagues, including our best athletes and even our music artists, who are still to this day used to enrich white institutions.
Even in the political arena, we have not made progress. When you look at African and Caribbean countries,
they are strangled by neocolonialism. Please don't be fooled because African people are in power there, but they economically, directly and indirectly, are controlled by the Western nations, as Kwame Nkrumah writes in his book Neocolonialism. He states, neocolonialism is also the worst form of imperialism. For those who practice it, it means power without responsibility, and for those who suffer from it, it means exploitation without redress. Neocolonialism is based upon the principle of breaking up former large united colonial territories into a number of small non-viable states which are incapable of independent development and must rely upon the former imperial power for defense and even internal security. Their economic and financial systems are linked, as in the colonial days, with those of the former colonial ruler. You see this across the African and Caribbean nations today, like Nigeria, the Congo, Burkina Faso, Guinea, Haiti, Jamaica, Trinidad, just to name a few. Let's look at Imperial France, for example. The French military and political leader Napoleon once said, "My decision to destroy the authority of the blacks in Saint-Dominique, now known as Haiti, is not so much based on considerations of commerce and money, as on the need to block forever the march of blacks in the world." And that statement can be validated by the way the French during that time and contemporary French deal with their former colonies. This is also true in France for its role in assassinating Africa's greatest progressive and revolutionary leaders in Thomas Sankara of Burkina Faso. Haiti is one example of how France forced her to pay back billions of dollars because they can no longer benefit from free labor of the Africans in Haiti. But did you know that 14 African countries are by colonial pact required to pay nearly 85% of their foreign reserve to the French Central Bank under the control of the French finance minister as we speak? It's disturbing that France almost makes nearly $500 billion a year from Africa in countries like Mali, the Congo, Gabon, Guinea, Ivory Coast, Chad, Central African Republic and Senegal, Burkina Faso, Togo, Niger, Benin, the Cameroon, and Guinea-Bissau are required to pay a colonial debt to France. For stubborn African leaders who decline this offer, they are either killed or overthrown through coup, but the docile ones were backed by recompensation with extravagant lifestyles while their subjects embrace poverty and distress. In fact, during the last 50 years, a total of 67 coups happened in 26 countries in Africa. 16 of those countries are ex-French colonies. When President Laurent Gbagbo of Cote d'Ivoire tried to end the French exploitation of the country, France organized the coup. During the long process to oust Gbagbo, France tanks, helicopter gunships, and special forces intervened directly in the conflict, fired on civilians, and killed many. To add insult to injury, France estimated that the French business community had lost several millions of dollars when, in the rush to leave Abidjan in 2006, the French army massacred 65 unarmed civilians and wounded 1,200 others. After France succeeded in the coup and transferred power to Alassane Ouattara, France requested Ouattara government to pay compensation to French business community for the loss during the Civil War. Indeed, the Ouattara government paid them twice what they said they had lost in leaving. The ex-French President Jacques Chirac in March 2008 stated that without Africa, France would smoothly go down in the rank of a third world power. Also, former President of France, Mitterrand, who left seat for Chirac, also said that without Africa, France wouldn't have any history in the 21st century. We often accuse African leaders
of corruption and servicing Western interests instead, but there is a clear explanation for their behavior. They behave so because they are afraid to be killed or victim of a coup. They want a powerful nation to back them in case of aggression or trouble. But contrary to friendly nation protection, the Western protection is often offered in exchange of these leaders renouncing to serve their own people or nation's interests. African leaders would work in the interest of their people if they were not constantly stalked and bullied by colonial countries. And the same could be said for the political and social organizations of our people in the United States. They are backed by white benefactors, which forces them to be irrelevant to the real issues of the masses of black people in this country. Organizations like the NAACP, the National Urban League, and we even have a Congressional Black Caucus that does little to nothing for the issues that are being faced in the community. So we can't say progress is being made.
In war, one of the first things the enemy does is destroy its adversary's ability to communicate with his ranks. Chaos likely ensues if a fighting force cannot communicate internally. Individual soldiers end up doing their own thing when left to their own devices. They make decisions based on their individual situations and in their individual interests. This allows the enemy to come in and pick them off one by one, using false information and propaganda, i.e. Tokyo Rose, instilling fear of being captured or killed, or by making the individual feel abandoned and left with no hope of victory. If the ability to communicate is maintained within a fighting force, it strengthens the group and provides confidence, assurance, and cohesion. Considering our penchant for sound bites, 140 character chirps, and listening to great speeches but not analyzing them and taking appropriate action, communication among black people has largely been reduced to little more than noise, and it's getting worse. Black newspapers used to be our main communication organ, but as the demand for electronic access to news has increased, newspapers have nearly become obsolete in some circles. Books were also a great source of communication because they contain so much knowledge written by scholars, historians, educators, and activists. But we now are so intellectually lazy that books have become passé and just something to brag about having on our bookshelves. Now we rely on Twitter and Facebook for our news. Newspapers, radio, internet, and televisions are the four dominant means of communications today. Black people still own a few hundred newspapers, many of which are struggling from week to week because black folks do not subscribe, nor do black businesses buy ads to any large degree. Black ownership of radios has drastically decreased in the past 20 years. Aside from a couple of great black-owned internet wire services, black-oriented sites are not black-owned. In the magazine industry, Johnson Publishing remains black-owned. However, they have ceased print jet and only Ebony remains as a print entity. Black Enterprise carries a heavy load as the only major black-owned publication focusing on economic issues. Now let's look at television. According to an article in TV News Check written by Doug Halloran, whites own 1,070 full-power commercial TV stations in 2013, up 14% from the 935 they owned in 2011. Racial minorities own 41 of the United States' 1,386 full-power commercial television stations in 2013, up 32% from the 31 that they owned in 2011. But only 9 of those stations were owned by African Americans during 2013, down 18% from the 11 they owned 2 years previously.
according to a study of station ownership released by the FCC. The FCC report also found that Asians own 19 full-power TV stations in 2013, up 73% from the 11 they owned in 2011. Hispanics or Latinos own 42 full-power TV stations in 2013, up 8% from the 39 that they owned in 2011. The obvious point here is the necessity for black people to own more communication outlets in order to control and disseminate pertinent information to black people. How? Establish syndicates that could purchase more outlets. Form an alliance of affluent and conscious blacks to purchase communications outlets and produce programs to empower rather than dumb down black people. Increase support of black-owned media and their advertisers by black consumers. Leverage the support of black readers, listeners, and viewers of black media by insisting one more than just mind-numbing, idiotic portrayals of black folks. These simple tactics could strengthen our lines of communications. Accessibility, accountability, and acceptability are essential elements to a strong and relevant media presence within the black society. Our current position in that game is untenable and tenuous at best. In light of the fact that we have the financial wherewithal, collectively and individually, to purchase and support media outlets, it is intriguing how we seem to have settled for much less than we need. Most of us understand and even admit that we are in a war behind enemy lines and fighting for respect and empowerment. That being the case, why are we content with having our lines of communication controlled by others? If we are reluctant to acquire more conscious media outlets, the least we can do is hold those who purport to be black media accountable by refusing to accept the trashy characters of black people and the negative portrayals of black life that bombard us every single day. Without control of communications, an army is severely handicapped. There is no black media or black representation media to defend the viewpoint of black people, so they operate on a bully pulpit against black people. There is no black media or black representation media to defend the viewpoint of black people, so our enemies operate on a bully pulpit against black people every single day. Fox News feels that they can talk about blacks in a certain way, knowing African Americans do not have a media channel to perform a proper response. This is where controlling the narrative of our culture, identity, and community is key. We must rid of the negative channels of communication, shore up the positive ones, and create more of our own. As this is another example how we have not progressed in society when it comes to media. We are suffering from gentrification, which is the buying and renovating of houses and stores in deteriorated urban neighborhoods by wealthier individuals, which in effect increases property values and displaces low-income families and small businesses. This is a common and widespread controversial topic in urban planning in America. And this is happening across the country, from New Orleans to Detroit to Harlem, New York. We are slowly losing our cultural basis, but we think progress is being made. Let's get to our present-day culture. People ask, what is the big deal about cultural appropriation? Cultural appropriation, in short, is when somebody adopts aspects of a culture that is not their own. But that's only the most basic definition. A deeper understanding of cultural appropriation also refers to a particular power dynamic in which members of a dominant culture take elements from a culture of people who have been systematically oppressed by that dominant group. That is why cultural appropriation is not the same as cultural exchange, when people share mutually with each other, because cultural exchange lacks the systematic power dynamic. It's also not the same as assimilation, where marginalized people adopt elements of the dominant culture in order to survive conditions that make life more of a struggle if they don't. And let's keep cultural appropriation in its proper context with a few examples. It lets people show love for the culture but remain prejudiced against its people. White people don't ask to be born with privilege, but what they choose to do with it is a different story. In a case of Yelp reviews in a recent article, recent transplants to a city say we're in search for authentic ethnic food without the sketchy neighborhoods, which usually happen to be what they call neighborhoods with higher numbers of people of color. The Yelpers are getting what they want, at least in terms of the neighborhood, as gentrification rapidly pushes people of color out of their homes and white-owned, friendly versions of their favorite ethnic restaurants open up. That is how it goes with cultural appropriation. Not sharing so there's more for everyone, but taking advantage of the power imbalance between the groups to have more for well-off white people and less for people of color. And this can happen because we live in a world in which racist white people can essentially say, we want your stuff, but we don't like you, by taking people's traditions while being biased against who they are as a person. Cultural appropriation shows that you don't have to like a person or respect their identity to feel entitled to take from them. Cultural appropriation can make things cool for white people, but too ethnic for people of color. The United States is a white-dominated society. And for proof of that, search no further than the way immigrants, indigenous people, and people of color are criticized for the things that distinguish us from white Americans. For example, standards of professionalism hold back all kinds of people who aren't white men. For an example, black women. The bar would be set different for them if they wore cornrows, dreadlocks, or an afro, some of the most natural ways to keep their hair up. So for black women, wearing their hair naturally is a meaningful declaration that they believe in their natural beauty. It's risky to make this declaration in a society that says black women must aspire to whiteness to have value. Compare that to fashion magazine reception of white teenager Kylie Jenner's epic cornrow or edgy dreadlocks. When black women have to fight for acceptance with the same styles as a young white woman can be admired for, what message does that send to black women and girls? It says that our beauty isn't beautiful at all, and that our features are only appealing when they are adopted by white women. Cultural appropriation allows privileged people to profit from oppressed people's labor. Supposedly, in the good old US of A, we are all free to pursue the capitalistic American dream of building our own wealth. But in reality, it's not that simple. For many people, barriers like classism, racism, xenophobia mean they don't have the right look, language, or position of privilege to earn income with their culturally specific tools. And yet oftentimes, white people can turn those same culturally specific tools into profit, thereby hurting the community they're borrowing from. So, for example, say a middle-class white woman gets involved in African spirituality and sees the chance to start a business based on what she learned. That might seem innocent enough. She has an interest in it, and she wants to make money off it. That's the dream, right? But the problem is that in order to sell her products, she has to participate in a discriminatory system. The system includes federal government policies that make it hard for African people to start their own businesses, as well as a professional culture in which white women and middle-class white women can fit more easily than poor African women. So while she profits, the African woman, she adopted her products from living deep cycles of poverty and unemployment. So white women dominate the industry of New Age materials with watered-down versions of African spirituality practices, drowning out the African voices speaking up about what Native communities need to survive. This allows them to be African without holding themselves accountable to the African communities. Someone with white privilege and class privilege has other options for earning income, so they don't have to resort to profiting from someone else's labor or culture. And the risk involved for marginalized people show it's more ethical to pursue another path. Cultural appropriation lets some people get rewarded for things the creators never got credit for. Who comes to mind when you think of rock and roll? Is it a white person? Who do you think started rock and roll? Is it Elvis Presley, the so-called king of rock and roll? Rock and roll came out of the blues and was initially largely shaped by black artists like Chuck Berry and Little Richard, for example. The problem was that in the 1950s, racist white people were clear that they did not want to support a black artist. So guess what they did? The record industry found success with white popular stars who molded a mainstream look and sound after black artists their racist white audiences would never support. Sam Phillips, a record executive who discovered Elvis Presley, summed it up when he apparently said, "If I could find a white man who had the Negro sound and the Negro feel, I could make $1 million or $1 billion." And while Elvis never claimed to have started it and was clear about the black artists who influenced him, our media has rewritten history to claim that Elvis invented rock and roll. And now it's hard to think of rock and roll ever having been music that came from the black community. This tradition of borrowing from black artists and promoting white artists over more talented black artists continues to make the record industry billions today. When Iggy Azalea gains fame and fortune through blackface imitation, black folk and hip-hop fans rightfully get upset. When Macklemore won 4 Grammys, even Macklemore's confused and thinks Kendrick Lamar should have won the Best Rap Album. Scan the nominations for many major award shows for an idea of how much whiteness represents greatness in the United States cultural consciousness. Then rethink the myth that the people who make it are successful because they're the hardest workers. Cultural appropriation allows white people to freely do what people of color were actively punished for doing. It can feel like a slap in the face to see carefree white people enjoy the practices that our people are penalized for. One recent example of this is the dance called twerking. This style of dance is demonized when women of African descent in the States do it, but was okay and accepted when a young white artist and Miley Cyrus performed the dance horribly in the 2013 VMA Awards. But please keep in mind that the dance move originates from West Africa. For instance, the Mapuka dance, and has been around for several generations. It was then adopted by African American culture in the 1990s. The dance originally was not done with sexual intent until it hit the hip-hop scene in America in the early 1990s, where it became sexualized as part of the hip-hop industry performed by video models and rap videos. But all of a sudden, since Miley Cyrus does it, it's okay. Claiming that the dominant culture has the right to take freely from disempowered groups sounds a lot like the lie of the white man's burden from the past. Colonizers used this concept to claim they had a duty to take land, resources, and identity from indigenous people, trying to justify everything from slavery to genocide. We have a lot of work to do to heal from the impact of oppression from the past through present day. Many examples of cultural appropriation may seem like no big deal, or like we should have more important things to worry about, but this can be, and has shown to be, a major hindrance of our people's progress. When we continue to allow this to happen without challenging other ethnic groups on exploiting our cultural specific tools. You should have the right to express yourself however you want, and you do. Nobody can force you to stop taking things from other cultures. The marginalized people whose cultures are appropriated don't have the institutional power currently to force you to stop, even if they wanted to. But changing oppressive everyday norms is a huge part of the work. Is one of the ways we can help stop the way society dehumanizes, erases, and ostracizes people of color. We have to create these institutions of power within our communities to stop other ethnic groups from coming into our communities, colonizing our art forms, and exploiting it to make billions of dollars while the originators don't get the credit or the fruits of the labor for creating it. Despite the many obstacles that stand in the way of our freedom, justice, and pursuit of happiness, there is still hope and opportunity to control our destiny. As the most honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey once said, although among the unthinking masses, there is always a number, even though small, of active minds ever ready and prepared to lay out the course of salvation. This is documented throughout our history of conscious-minded Africans that look to Africa as a destiny or a guidepost for her peoples. When we accept our identity as African, we, like Garvey said, can use our global history as a guidepost of the race. Some of our ancestors kept Africa at the core of their being. There were cultural survivals throughout the Caribbean where Africans were dropped off into slavery. The Maroons of Jamaica who escaped and tried their best to recreate the Africa they had known. The Jukas of Suriname, the people of St. Vincent in the 17th and 18th centuries that recreated the African environment through language, religion, architecture, through social organization, and any other way they could, and for many of them were born in Africa. As time went on, an increasing number of Africans were born here in the West. That desire to reunite with Africa in any form or fashion, either physically or spiritually, continued to manifest itself. And there are many other ways in which Africans during that era of slavery manifested that desire. For example, researchers in Afro-America have shown that the slave songs of many of the old spirituals contained in their lyrics expressed a desire to go back to Africa. Sometimes the words were couched in religious terms because the enslaved Africans had been fed with the Bible. But in essence, very often, these slave songs show a desire to return. Their lyrics were equating Africa with heaven. Similar references to Africa have been found in the 19th century Caribbean songs. Often we are told that the enslaved Africans went as far as to commit suicide in hope and expectation of having departed this life. Their spirits would then reunite with their ancestors in the African homeland. Throughout the era of slavery, especially revolutionary enslaved Africans, always had the idea of Africa not very far from their activities. Toussaint L'Ouverture, once he helped liberate his nation of Haiti by destroying the European adversaries, turned his thoughts to Africa and made elaborate plans for leading an expedition to West Africa to liberate the homeland from the slave traders. The Maroons were exiled by the British to Nova Scotia, in Canada in the late 18th century, and those Africans asked to be sent to Africa once they got to Nova Scotia. The result was some 500 Maroons were shipped to Sierra Leone. The remarkable insurrection of Amistad, when Africans seized control of a slave ship, eventually got back to Africa, and we highlight all of this to point out that revolutionary enslaved Africans often did what was necessary to get back to Africa. And then we had the Pan-African predecessors of the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, like Martin Delany, Alexander Crummell, Bishop Henry McNeill Turner, Reverend Henry Highland Garnet, Mary Ann Shadd, and Dr. Anna Julia Cooper. Early Pan-Africans began to organize in the 19th century because they were acutely aware of the fact that Africa was about to be gobbled up by Europe. They began to agitate and gave a courageous effort to tell black people we need to unite on an international basis to save Africa. Pan-Africanism may be defined as the attempts by African peoples to link up their struggles for their mutual benefit. The pioneers of the movement thought largely of global linkages. Pan-Africanism became inevitable with the inception of the transatlantic slave trade. Europe, by scattering Africa to the winds, inevitably, if unwittingly, set in motion a process which would bring scattered Africa together again at a higher level. It was inevitable that the forcibly uprooted Africans would yearn to rediscover their homeland. It was inevitable that the journey to rediscovery would be a journey against the colonialism that had uprooted Africa in the first place. New World Africans, in time, lost their sharp edge of their specific African nationalities. Thousands of miles and several generations away from the African homeland, it mattered less than before whether one was Yoruba, Hausa, or Mandingo. As the years rolled by, fewer and fewer New World Africans knew exactly from whence in the African homeland they have sprung. But one thing they could be certain of: they were African. Often the slave owner left the mark of his dominance indelibly stamped on the forehead of the New World African. But even this unfortunate circumstance could never totally obliterate the remembrance of Africa. Throughout our history, there has been a conflict, at times a muted conflict, at times a violent conflict, between those who remember Africa and those who would suppress that memory. And if black nationalism, Pan-Africanism, has been the dominant ideology of the New World African masses, it has also been a heavily persecuted ideology. The powers that be have sought to destroy nationalist movements with a fever not usually experienced even by less conservative integrationist organizations. Marcus Garvey, a Pan-Africanist from Jamaica, Anton Lim Bede, a Pan-Africanist from South Africa, and Malcolm X, a Pan-Africanist from North America, were all brilliant at reminding our people of our ancestors' incredible achievements and reminding us of our present struggle to help inspire us to improve for a better future. We have to come to the conclusion, when you have studied our true global history, we have not made progress like we are made to believe. When we start controlling our destiny again, that's progress being made. When we start following our traditional African customs of reaching back to help the least of our brothers and sisters, that is progress being made. When we start controlling our economy and creating institutions and industries to benefit African people to create jobs for us and enjoy the fruits of their labor, that is progress being made. When we start controlling our politics and the government that represents us and controlling political institutions to help govern our people, that is progress being made. When we start controlling our social institutions and holding accountable our negative social behaviors and incompetent leaders to present a positive image to the world, that is progress being made. When African and Caribbean nations stop being manipulated by foreign aid of their former colonial masters and being indirectly controlled by them, then progress is being made. But as long as we don't control the aspects of life mentioned, we are in no better shape since the Ma'afa. We need to effectively enlighten and awaken the African cultural consciousness of our people on a mass level all over the world. This will help eliminate the indoctrination of hatred towards one another and love for the people that despise our existence. A national plan of empowerment. This plan will design and create and implement various institutions that produce African-centered leaders, nation builders, economists, medical doctors, lawyers, scientists, engineers, agriculturalists, educators, and various other skill sets required to maintain and defend our nations and communities. We need a redistribution of wealth through African group economics. As we build locally, we need to think globally and study, network, and link up with other Africans that are like-minded to integrate our efforts and build a working unity economically through trade, distribution of goods, and providing services to one another. And for those people, especially African people, who are doubtful or have a defeatist mentality and attitude that our people can never do anything on a global scale, let us turn to history as a guide and remember the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, who organized over 1 million African people throughout the African world for the better part of a decade and produced the largest mass movement the world has ever seen. Let us remember arguably Africa's greatest post-colonial president in Thomas Sankara, who in short order produced a self-sufficient African nation in Burkina Faso, turning it from one of the poorest countries to the most self-sufficient in Africa. Let us remember Toussaint L'Ouverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, who liberated their country from enslavement and defended it by defeating 3 powerful European colonial nations in Spain, Britain, and France. We have shown we can organize and have international unity. We have shown we can create a self-sufficient government. And we have shown we can defend our interests since our Ma'afa. So don't let anyone tell us what we can and can't achieve, because it has been proven by our ancient and contemporary ancestors. For Africans forever, backwards never.